At midnight, the billionaire froze in the doorway. The nanny was asleep on the cold nursery floor, her hand inside the crib as if shielding his child from the world. He hired her to work, not to risk herself, so why did it feel like she was guarding more than just the baby? Before we dive into this unforgettable journey, tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? If stories about love, sacrifice, and second chances speak to your heart, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow we're bringing you another powerful story you won't want to miss. The rain had already started by the time Evelyn Hart reached the long, winding driveway. Her wipers swiped furiously, the headlights carving fleeting arcs through the dense mist. She checked the address twice on her phone before the wrought iron gates loomed into view, sleek and imposing against the night. Somewhere beyond them, hidden by manicured hedges and shadows, was the Blackwell estate, her new work. She pressed the intercom button, voice steady despite the damp chill soaking her coat. "It's Evelyn Hart, from the agency." A pause, then the deep timbre of a man's voice crackled back. "Come through." The gates swung open with mechanical precision, and she eased her little hatchback forward, tires crunching on the wet gravel. She had taken plenty of nanny jobs before, some in modest homes, some in wealthy suburbs, but never anything like this. Damian Blackwell wasn't just rich. He was the Damian Blackwell, founder of 3 multi-million-dollar tech companies, a man who could make or break an entire market with one decision. She parked near the side entrance, where a discreet golden light spilled onto the slick stone steps. A tall man in a charcoal sweater and dark slacks opened the door before she could knock. His eyes, sharp, assessing, flicked over her once before he stepped aside. "You're late," he said. Her stomach tightened, though her tone stayed calm. The storm slowed traffic. He didn't reply right away, only led her inside to a gleaming hallway lined with black and white photographs of city skylines. The air was warm, scented faintly with cedar. "Sophie's upstairs," he said finally. "She's been..." The understatement wasn't lost on her. She'd heard from the agency that the last 3 nannies had quit within a month, citing sleepless nights and relentless crying. Some hinted that Damian was impossible to work for, others that the baby was simply too difficult. They climbed the wide staircase, her footsteps muffled on the plush carpet. At the nursery door, he stopped. "Cries most nights. Nothing works for long. You'll find formula in the warmer, diapers in the second drawer. If you need something, ask Mrs. Klein, the housekeeper. I'll be in my study." His gaze lingered on her as if measuring her resolve. "And Evelyn?" "I don't tolerate carelessness." She met his eyes. "Neither do I." Inside, the nursery was softly lit, pale pink walls lined with shelves of stuffed animals and storybooks. The crib stood near the center, draped with a white canopy, and in it, Sophie, tiny, flushed, fists flailing, wailed as though the world had betrayed her. Evelyn set down her bag, removed her damp coat, and approached slowly. "Hey, little one," she murmured. "It's all right. I'm here now." She tried the bottle first. Sophie turned her head away. A lullaby hummed under her breath, but the crying didn't stop. Rocking didn't help either. Evelyn crouched beside the crib, letting the baby see her face clearly. "It's okay," she whispered. "You're safe." Minutes stretched into an hour. The storm outside deepened, wind rattling the windows. Eventually, Evelyn sank onto the thick rug beside the crib, one hand resting gently inside, her fingertips brushing Sophie's tiny hand. The crying faltered, then quieted. The little fingers curled around hers. Evelyn exhaled softly, not daring to move. She stayed there, cross-legged on the floor, until the baby's breathing evened out. Damian hadn't meant to check the monitor again. He'd told himself that hiring through the agency meant standards, training, professionalism. But old habits, the ones formed in the sleepless aftermath of Sophie's birth, died hard. He glanced at the wall-mount screen above his desk. The camera in the nursery gave a clear view. Evelyn, sitting on the floor, her back straight despite the late hour, one arm inside the crib. She wasn't on her phone. She wasn't nodding off. She was simply there, still and present, as if the baby's fragile calm depended entirely on her. His frown deepened. It was unusual. Most nannies preferred the rocking chair or paced the room endlessly, switching tactics every few minutes. But Evelyn seemed content to stay exactly where she was, absorbing Sophie's restlessness until it ebbed away. He turned back to his work, but the image lingered in his mind. By midnight, he checked again. She hadn't moved far, just shifted to a curled position on the rug, one hand still inside the crib. Damian leaned back in his chair, sleeping on the nursery floor. Was it dedication or poor judgment? Upstairs, Evelyn was aware of the stiffness creeping into her legs, but ignored it. She'd worked with infants before, but Sophie's distress felt deeper than ordinary fussiness. It wasn't hunger or a wet diaper. It was something older, more ingrained, as if the baby feared being alone more than anything else in the world. So she stayed. The storm outside cracked with a sudden flash of lightning, and Sophie startled, her tiny fingers clutching tighter around Evelyn's. "I know, sweetheart," Evelyn whispered. "Storms can be scary, but I'm right here." At some point past 1 a.m., she drifted into a light doze, her shoulder against the crib's edge, the hum of the white noise machine filling the room. When she woke again, a thin line of light edged the curtains. Sophie was still asleep, one fist curled near her cheek. Evelyn stretched quietly, careful not to jostle the crib, and glanced at the clock. 5:47. A soft knock sounded, and Mrs. Klein, a stout woman with a no-nonsense bun, peeked in. "You're up early." Her eyes took in Evelyn's position on the floor. "Did you sleep here?" Evelyn smiled, faintly. It was the only thing that worked. Mrs. Klein's brows rose, but she only nodded. "Mr. Blackwell will want to see you in the morning room after breakfast." That gave Evelyn pause. It was too early for a complaint, or too late for him to be indifferent. Damian was already there when she entered, standing by the tall windows as rain misted the glass. He turned, coffee cup in hand, his expression unreadable. "I saw you on the monitor," he said without preamble, "sleeping on the floor." Evelyn kept her chin level. "It wasn't part of the plan, but Sophie wouldn't settle unless I stayed close." And his eyes narrowed slightly, as though weighing the truth in her voice. Most would have tried something else, or called for help. "I've learned that sometimes what a child needs isn't in the handbook." A long silence stretched before he nodded once. "We'll see how you manage the week." As she left the room, Evelyn caught his reflection in the glass, watching her go, his brow furrowed, not with annoyance, but with something closer to curiosity. Upstairs, Sophie stirred in her crib, her small whimper fading the moment Evelyn stepped into the room. Damian's decision was made in that moment, though he wouldn't have admitted it aloud. He would keep an eye on her. He didn't know yet whether Evelyn Hart was reckless or remarkable, but something told him that whichever it was going to change everything. By the time Evelyn came downstairs, the rain had lightened into a soft drizzle, the pale gray light of morning filtering through the mansion's high windows. The air was rich with the scent of brewed coffee and warm bread. She followed the hall toward the morning room, still feeling the faint stiffness in her back from the nursery floor. Sophie had stirred once just before dawn, but had settled again with only a murmured reassurance. Damian was already seated at the long table, a tablet in front of him, though his eyes weren't on it. He looked up when she entered, gaze direct, as if measuring her before she'd even spoken. "Sit," he said, gesturing to the chair opposite. Evelyn took the seat, folding her hands in her lap. The porcelain coffee pot between them gleamed, untouched. "I want to discuss last night," Damian began, his tone even but carrying the weight of authority. "Mrs. Klein tells me you slept on the floor of the nursery." "We did," Evelyn replied, keeping her voice calm. "Sophie was waking every time I tried to leave. She's panicked when she's alone. The floor was the only place where I could stay close without moving her from the crib." Damian's brows drew together, the faintest shadow of disapproval crossing his face. "That's not a standard method of care. It's improvised." "I know," she said evenly. "But in my experience, comfort isn't always in the manual. She needed to know someone was there. That was the only thing that worked." He leaned back in his chair, studying her for a moment. Most nannies would have called for assistance. or found another way. I didn't want to make it more disruptive. She's already been through several changes in caregivers in the last month. Evelyn's voice softened. She needs consistency more than anything else. For a beat, Damian said nothing. Outside, the rain tapped lightly against the tall glass panes. From the doorway, Mrs. Klein's presence was quiet but unmistakable. She had brought a tray of fresh croissants, setting them on the table with the careful precision of someone used to working in a house where appearances mattered. Her eyes flicked between the two of them, and though she kept her expression neutral, Evelyn could almost feel the curiosity behind it. Damian reached for the coffee pot and poured himself a cup, the steam curling in the space between them. "I don't appreciate methods that aren't discussed beforehand," he said, though his voice was less sharp than before. "I expect professionalism in my household." "I understand," Evelyn replied, "but I also believe in doing what's best for the child in the moment." Their eyes held for a fraction longer than either intended, the tension taut but not hostile. Finally, Damian took a sip of his coffee and set it down. "Sophie does seem calmer this morning," he admitted, almost reluctantly. In the kitchen, the clatter of dishes and the low murmur of voices signaled that the staff had already picked up on the conversation. It was impossible not to in a house like this, where the hierarchy ran deep and every interaction was observed. When Evelyn left the morning room to check on Sophie, she passed through the kitchen. Conversation dipped for a moment before resuming, just low enough that she could catch snippets. Sloane's voice imagined maybe he likes her, or maybe she's next to go. She kept walking, letting the whispers roll off her. In her experience, households like this thrived on speculation, and she had no intention of feeding it. Upstairs, Sophie was awake, lying on her back in the crib, eyes bright and curious. Evelyn smiled and leaned over. "Good morning, sweetheart." When she lifted Sophie into her arms, the baby's tiny hands clung to her shirt. She smelled faintly of baby powder and sleep. Evelyn carried her down toward the sunroom, where the morning light pooled warmly over the pale marble floor. A few minutes later, Damian appeared, phone in hand, speaking in low tones about some meeting. He reached out automatically when he saw Sophie, but the baby twisted in Evelyn's arms, her face crumpling in the beginning of a cry. Evelyn shifted her hold, murmuring softly. Sophie settled almost instantly, her small head pressing into Evelyn's shoulder. The moment was brief but unmistakable. Damian's hand lingered in the air before he withdrew it, his gaze flicking from his daughter's calm expression back to Evelyn's. Something unreadable passed across his face before he simply said, "I'll be in my study." Evelyn watched him go, feeling the subtle shift in the air that morning. She hadn't set out to win Sophie's trust over her father's, but the child's instinct was undeniable. In the kitchen, the staff would already be spinning the moment into a dozen different theories about the new nanny, about Mr. Blackwell, about what might happen next. In the nursery halls of wealthy homes, stories spread faster than truth. But in the quiet space between Sophie's even breaths and the soft patter of rain, Evelyn knew her focus had to remain on the little girl in her arms. Upstairs, Damian stood at his office window, phone forgotten on the desk, watching as Evelyn carried Sophie down the hall. The image clung to him, the way Sophie had reached for her without hesitation, the way Evelyn's presence seemed to quiet storms that no one else could touch. He told himself it was only the first morning, that he would reserve judgment. But a part of him, the part that hadn't slept peacefully in months, was already wondering if this woman might succeed where everyone else had failed. By the end of Evelyn's first week, the mansion had settled into a rhythm, if it could be called that. The sprawling Blackwell estate, with its marble halls and echoing ceilings, still felt foreign to her. She moved through it with quiet precision, keeping her steps soft on the polished floors, speaking only when necessary. Her world here revolved around Sophie, feeding her, bathing her, playing with her in the sunlit nursery where pastel curtains swayed gently with the breeze. Damian had observed from a careful distance. At first, he half expected her to make some obvious mistake, to confirm the suspicion that no nanny could possibly last more than a few weeks in his home. But Sophie's demeanor had shifted. The child who once whimpered through mornings and screamed into the night now giggled. Actual giggles that carried faintly down the hall. The change was subtle but undeniable. Still, he noticed things that puzzled him. Evelyn hadn't moved into the guest room he had instructed Mrs. Whitmore, the head housekeeper, to prepare. When he passed by it in the evenings, the bed was pristine, untouched. Yet she never complained of fatigue during the day. On the sixth night, Damian lingered outside the nursery door, after returning late from a meeting. It was just past 11 and the rain had begun again, a steady rhythm on the glass. He expected to hear Sophie's cries. Instead, he heard a low, soothing hum, the kind of sound a mother might make without even thinking. He opened the door just enough to see her. Evelyn sat cross-legged on the nursery floor in her simple cotton pajamas, her back against the crib. Sophie's small hand reached through the bars, her fingers curling around Evelyn's. Evelyn's head was tilted toward the child, her lips moving in that same quiet song. Damian's jaw tightened, not from anger, but from something less familiar. He watched longer than he meant to, taking in the way Evelyn didn't shift or fidget, as though holding Sophie's hand was the most natural place to be. By morning, the household staff had begun to talk. It wasn't malicious, not exactly. In the cavernous kitchen, whispers rose between clinking plates and the hiss of the coffee machine. "Sleeps on the floor in there," murmured Martha, one of the maids, arranging fresh fruit in a bowl. "Hopefully this isn't the case for another hour. Don't forget to be on guard," and then she turned toward the doorway as if checking to see if anyone important overheard. "It's true. Mrs. Whitmore told me she offered her the guest room twice, said it's more comfortable. Evelyn refused, says the baby sleeps better when she's close." The conversation ended abruptly when Evelyn walked in, carrying Sophie in her arms. The baby's cheek rested against her shoulder, one tiny fist clutching a corner of Evelyn's cardigan. Evelyn didn't seem to notice the way the room quieted. She simply asked for a warm bottle, thanking Martha softly before leaving again. Damian caught that moment from the hallway, his curiosity sharpened. Most employees bent under the weight of the Blackwell household's silent judgments. Evelyn seemed entirely unbothered. Later that night, he found himself in his study, unable to focus on the figures scrolling across his laptop. He remembered the monitor in Sophie's room, the same one that had alerted him to Evelyn's first night on the floor. Without quite knowing why, he clicked it on. The image sharpened in the soft glow of the night vision camera. There she was again, not in bed but on the rug, a folded blanket beneath her. Sophie slept peacefully in the crib, her chest rising and falling in that steady rhythm only infants have. Evelyn lay on her side, one hand resting gently on the wooden bars, as if maintaining an invisible connection. It was unusual, but Damian couldn't deny the evidence. Sophie was calmer. She laughed now when Evelyn played peek-a-woo. She reached for her when startled by sudden noises. She fell asleep faster and stayed asleep longer. The next day, as he passed the nursery, he caught another glimpse of something that made him pause. Evelyn was on the floor with Sophie, building a little tower of blocks. Her hair was loose, falling over her shoulder, and she was smiling. A rare, unguarded smile. Sophie babbled in response, knocking the tower over with a delighted squeal. Evelyn laughed, a soft sound that, for reasons he didn't understand, caught in his chest. Still, there was something about her he couldn't place. That night, after the house had gone quiet, he walked past the nursery and noticed the faint sound of her voice, not singing this time, but speaking, low, urgent, into a phone. She was standing by the window, the phone pressed close, her back to the door. Damian couldn't make out the words, only the tone, a mix of relief and fatigue, like someone speaking to a confidant after a long day. When she hung up, she lingered there for a moment, her hands on the sill, before turning back toward the crib. Damian stepped away before she saw him, his mind turning over questions he wasn't ready to ask. The next evening, it happened again, the soft singing, drifting into the hallway. He stood there longer this time, letting the sound wash over him. It was unlike anything in his world of quarterly reports and high-stakes negotiations. There was no performance in it, no artifice, just warmth, patience, and something else he didn't want to name. He told himself he was only making sure Sophie was well cared for, but as he turned away, the truth pressed at the edges of his thoughts. Evelyn was becoming someone he noticed, not just as Sophie's nanny, but as a presence in this house that reached places he thought he'd sealed shut. The rain tapered off the following morning, leaving the air in the Blackwell estate damp and heavy. Damian sat at the far end of the breakfast table, skimming his emails on a tablet. Sophie was already in her high chair, babbling between bites of oatmeal. Evelyn stood nearby, patiently wiping the corners of the baby's mouth after each spoonful, unhurried. Damian glanced up briefly, noting the way Sophie's eyes followed Evelyn's every movement. There was an ease between them, unpracticed but real, that he didn't quite understand. He wasn't used to seeing his daughter so content. Mrs. Whitmore entered to pour coffee, her expression polite but guarded. Damian noticed her eyes flick toward Evelyn, then back to him, as if waiting for him to comment. He didn't. Instead, he sipped his coffee, letting the scene play out. Later that day, he returned from a conference call earlier than expected and found himself pausing at the nursery door. The sight inside was oddly grounding. Evelyn on the floor with Sophie, who was propped against a small pile of pillows. They were surrounded by picture books and plush toys, a half-finished tea set laid out between them. Evelyn's hair had slipped free from its bun, framing her face in loose wave. She was telling Sophie a story, her voice lilting, the words slow and rhythmic, as if she wanted the baby to understand every syllable. Damian's first instinct was to interrupt. Why? She hadn't moved Sophie to the playpen. But he stopped. Sophie's head tilted toward Evelyn's voice, her expression one of quiet fascination. This wasn't chaos. It was calm. That evening, Damian lingered longer than usual in his study before turning on the monitor. Evelyn was in the nursery again, sitting on the floor, with Sophie's hand clasped loosely in hers. He watched the slow, unconscious way her thumb stroked the child's fingers, a repetitive gesture meant to reassure. She didn't notice the camera, didn't shift as if aware of being watched. She simply stayed there until Sophie's eyes fluttered shut. Only then did Evelyn ease her hand free, tuck the blanket more snugly around the baby, and lie down on the floor herself, the folded blanket beneath her back. He shut off the monitor and leaned back in his chair, rubbing a hand over his jaw. She was breaking every expectation he had set for her role, and yet, it was working. 2 nights later, something changed. Damian returned home past midnight after an industry gala. As he climbed the stairs, a faint light drew his attention to the nursery. The door was ajar. He approached silently, prepared to check on Sophie, but stopped when he heard Evelyn's voice, low, urgent. She stood near the window again, the soft glow from the lamp outlining her figure. "Fine, really," she was saying. "It's different here. She's sweet. The baby's sweet. I can't leave her like this." Paused, then a softer tone. "No, I haven't told him. I can't. Not yet." Damian's hand tightened on the doorframe. She hung up a moment later, lingering by the glass with her arms wrapped loosely around herself. He stepped back into the shadows before she could see him, his mind restless with unanswered questions. The following day, he tried to ignore the unease her phone call had stirred, but the image of her standing in that quiet room, speaking to someone she trusted, stayed with him. It was strange. He didn't know much about her, but the idea of her keeping secrets in his house pressed at something in him that felt dangerously close to personal. That evening, after the house fell silent, he heard it again, the singing. This time he didn't stop at the hallway. He stepped just close enough to see her through the crack in the nursery door. Evelyn was seated on the floor beside the crib, her back leaning against the bars. Sophie's tiny hand rested in her lap, and Evelyn's voice wove through the air, gentle and steady. The melody was unfamiliar, something simple and unpolished, but it held a quiet beauty that made him pause in the dark. For a moment, he let himself listen without judgment. The sound was unlike anything else in this house, free of performance, expectation, or demand. It was just real. And in that reality, something inside him shifted, subtle and When he finally turned away, he told himself it was only because Sophie needed stability, because the nanny was doing her job, because it didn't matter to him beyond that. But deep down, he already knew that wasn't entirely true. The night began with a low rumble in the distance, the kind of sound that rolls through the air before a storm truly arrives. Damian noticed it from his study window, the city skyline barely visible through the thickening clouds. By the time the clock neared 11, rain lashed against the glass and a sharp crack of thunder rattled the panes. Upstairs, Evelyn sat cross-legged on the nursery floor, folding a small pile of freshly laundered onesies. Sophie slept in her crib, her breathing steady, the occasional sigh escaping her lips. Evelyn paused when she heard the first loud crash of thunder. She glanced at the baby, relieved that Sophie hadn't stirred. But when the next lightning flash came, the room plunged into sudden darkness. The hum of the monitor and nightlight vanished in the same instant. Evelyn exhaled slowly, letting her eyes adjust, then reached for the small emergency lamp she had spotted on her first night here. The warm glow was dim but steady. That was when she heard the whimper. Sophie shifted in her crib, tiny fists rubbing at her face, her cheeks flushed. Evelyn moved quickly, brushing her hand over the baby's forehead. Heat met her skin, hotter than it should be. "Sophie," she murmured, keeping her voice low. "It's all right, I'm here." The fever was undeniable. Evelyn gathered Sophie into her arms, rocking gently as she thought through her next steps. There was no time to hesitate. She fetched the thermometer from the changing table drawer, confirming the temperature, 102.3. Footsteps sounded in the hall, heavy and quick. Damian appeared in the doorway, framed by shadows and lamplight from the hall. His gaze immediately went to the baby in Evelyn's arms. It happened. His voice was tight. "Running a fever," Evelyn said, shifting Sophie slightly so he could see her flushed face. "It came on fast. I'm going to get some cool compresses. Keep her comfortable while we monitor her." Damian stepped fully into the room. "I'll call Dr. Hayes." "He'll say the same thing for now," Evelyn replied calmly, already moving to the small bathroom that adjoined the nursery. "We need to bring her temperature down and keep her hydrated. If it climbs higher or she doesn't improve, then we call him." Damian hesitated, unused to being overruled in his own home. But the sight of Sophie, cheeks red and eyes glassy, silenced any argument. He followed Evelyn into the bathroom, watching as she ran cool water over a soft cloth, wrung it out, and folded it neatly. Back in the nursery, Evelyn settled onto the floor with Sophie in her lap. She dabbed the cloth gently over the baby's forehead, speaking to her in a low, soothing tone. Damian stood nearby, restless, unsure where to put his hands. "Can I?" he started. "Hold the blanket up for me," she said without looking up. "We don't want her to get chilled." He knelt beside her, taking the edge of the small blanket and holding it loosely so that it draped over Sophie without trapping heat. Their hands brushed briefly as Evelyn adjusted it, and he felt the faintest spark at the contact, unexpected and distracting. The storm outside grew louder, wind howling against the windows, but inside the nursery the world felt reduced to the small circle of light from the lamp, the steady sound of Evelyn's voice and Sophie's faint whimpers. Minutes passed like this, quiet teamwork in the dimness. Evelyn shifted the compress, replacing it with another cool one, always keeping Sophie close. Damian found himself watching her more than the baby, noticing the care in her movements, the way her brows drew together in concentration. Sophie's eyes eventually fluttered closed, her breathing evening out. Evelyn didn't move right away, her hand resting lightly on the baby's chest as if to reassure herself. Damian exhaled slowly, tension easing from his shoulders. He hadn't realized until now how tightly he'd been holding himself. "Resting," Evelyn said softly, meeting his eyes. He nodded, glancing between her and Sophie. "You handled that well." "It's what I'm here for," she replied, but there was no trace of arrogance in her tone, just quiet certainty. As the storm raged outside, Damian remained in the nursery, leaning back against the wall. Evelyn stayed seated on the floor, Sophie still in her arms. The distance between them felt smaller than it had ever been. When the thunder rolled again, Damian's gaze lingered on her, a flicker of something unfamiliar stirring beneath his usual reserve. And in that moment, he realized he was looking at her differently than before. Damian stayed long after he would normally have retreated to the fortress of his study. The storm seemed to anchor him to the nursery, to the quiet choreography of Evelyn's care. She refreshed the compress, checked Sophie's temperature again, and whispered to her about rain tapping rooftops and angels counting drops. When the baby stirred, Evelyn tipped a small syringe of water between her lips, watching her swallow, then waited before offering another sip. "Do you need anything?" Damian finally asked. "More clothes," she said, "and a fresh onesie. The drawer with the moon on it?" He moved quickly, grateful for a clear task. Drawers were simple. You opened one, found the thing, and delivered it. In moments like these, simplicity felt like mercy. When he returned, Evelyn worked with a focus that made his chest ache. Competence born not from training manuals, but from countless nights like this. They changed Sophie together. He held the blanket like a curtain, while Evelyn swapped the damp fabric for soft cotton, quick as a magician's trick but gentle. Their fingers brushed again, a brief static warmth neither acknowledged. He noticed her hands were cool from the water, and without thinking, he wrapped the blanket higher around her arms. "Good," she murmured. "Keep the core warm, surface cool." Lightning stitched the sky, and the house answered with a low groan. Somewhere outside, a branch snapped. Evelyn didn't flinch. She began a hum pitched just under the storm, steady enough to give the room a heartbeat of its own. Sophie settled deeper, the fevered flush paling by fragile degrees. Damian's phone vibrated. He grabbed it, but the screen was useless, no service. The outage had taken more than lights. He kept the alarm app open anyway, marking minutes between compress changes, sips of water, and the moments when Sophie's breathing steadied. "Most people panic," he said quietly. "You don't." "I can panic later," she replied. "She needs calm now." Her words landed like both a rebuke and wisdom. He let them sit in the dim light until they became truth. They spoke in low tones, whispers meant to weave through the thunder. He asked how she knew these tricks. The timing, the temperature, the patience. She said only, "Experience." Some histories announce themselves more in what they refuse to tell. Sophie whimpered. Evelyn coaxed another sip of water into her mouth, then dabbed her neck. "You're doing so well," she soothed. "Small sips, small steps." "Should I try the generator?" Damian asked. "Start the HVAC," she said softly. "Sudden air might shock her. Let's wait until she's fully asleep." He nodded, oddly relieved to be told no. Minutes folded into nearly an hour. The fever edged down. Sophie's lashes rested heavier against her cheeks. Evelyn tried to place her in the crib, but the child's fingers clung to her sleeve. "Stay," Evelyn whispered. "I know." She adjusted, cradling Sophie a little longer before trying again, slower. This time, when the small hand searched, she guided it gently to the mattress. Sophie's grip loosened without entirely letting go. Damian watched the exchange, the unspoken permission, the way absence was replaced with presence rather than distance, and something in him loosened. "Temperature?" he asked. "Down 1/2 degree." Relief swept through him so quickly he turned away, masking it by looking out at the lawn shimmering under rain. "When my wife was alive," he said roughly, "she turned storms into stories." Sophie would have been too young to remember. "I forget sometimes that babies carry shadows they can't name." Evelyn's reply was simple. "We name them for them, until they can." He turned back. The lamplight carved her profile into warm light. She looked both young and ageless, the face of someone who had kept vigil more times than she could count. Another compress, another swallow. The minutes kept their rhythm. When the refrigerator downstairs clicked dive, they both noticed the subtle shift in the air. Power had returned. The monitor blinked back to life. "Generator?" she asked. "Backup grid," he replied. "Full power soon." "Let's keep the light low," she murmured. "She's following the quiet." He dimmed the lamp back to its circle. The choice felt deliberate, selecting the nursery over the mansion, one child's peace over the needs of 100 empty rooms. Sophie's skin was cooler now. The furious heat had softened to damp warmth, then to the memory of warmth. She sighed and, for the first time since the blackout, surrendered to untroubled sleep. Evelyn eased the compress to the edge of the crib and tucked the blanket where it couldn't ride up to her face. "Fixed the worst," Evelyn said. "Chigalauk." "Her hands," she replied, showing the baby's open fingers. "And her breathing? It's round again." He listened. She was right. The room seemed to take the same round breath. There was nothing left but to be present. Damian sat on the rug beside her, backed to the crib, both staring at the small circle of lamplight on the floor as if it were a fire. The storm moved off in stages. Drips from the eaves replaced thunder, and a lone car hissed along wet asphalt. "You were right," he said at last, "about staying close." She didn't look at him. "About what matters in the dark," she said softly. He almost smiled, not at her, but at the precision of the thought. "I didn't hire you to be brave," he admitted, "but I'm glad you are." "I'm not brave," she said. "I'm practiced." "Practiced at what?" "At keeping promises no one hears." He thought he understood, and also knew he didn't. The not knowing no longer felt like a threat. It felt like a door he might one day knock on. Sophie stirred and settled again. Evelyn's hand hovered above the blanket, then dropped to her lap. The last rumble of the storm faded. Somewhere, a clock resumed ticking. Damian felt the house expand around them, not with emptiness, but with space made intentionally. He rose first and offered his hand. She accepted, standing carefully so the floor wouldn't creak. Their palms stayed together a fraction longer than necessary. It said, "Thank you." It said, "I saw what you did." At the doorway, he paused and looked back. Evelyn had returned to her chair, not to sleep, but to keep watch a little longer. He understood now that watching preserved nightmares. It meant devotion. "Have tea sent up," he said. "Warm water is fine," she replied, "for both of us." He nodded, stepping into the hall. "Evelyn," he said, and when she looked up, he let the old distance drop. "Thank you." She bowed her head slightly. "You're welcome." Sophie exhaled, long and even. The lamp's circle held. Damian left the nursery with the careful steps of a man leaving a chapel, and realized the feeling in his chest was not fear, nor even relief. It was respect, solid and anchoring. He carried it with him like a weight he was glad to bear. The house was quieter than it had been in days. After the storm, after Sophie's fever broke, there was a calm that felt almost unnatural. Damian had retreated to his study, buried in contracts, but he kept finding himself listening for small sounds. The faint hum of a lullaby from the nursery, the clink of a bottle being washed in the kitchen, Evelyn's voice murmuring softly when she late afternoon light slid in through the tall windows, cutting gold bars across the polished floor. Damian's pen slowed over the page. Somewhere down the hall, he caught the distant ring of a phone. Muffled, not the sharp tone of a landline, but the softer chime of a personal cell. He wouldn't have noticed except for the change in Evelyn's tone. It wasn't her nanny voice, the one that soothed and coaxed, that kept Sophie's world steady. This was different, low and urgent, the kind of voice people use when they're hoping no one else is listening. He couldn't make out every word, but the ones he did were enough to pull him to the doorway. "I told you I'd send it by Friday. Now, they can't wait? But if I take another shift, a pause, then a sigh that sounded like it carried years in it. I can't lose the job. He's just a kid, and if they stop treatment..." Damian froze before she could see him. He shouldn't be here, shouldn't be listening, but something in the way she said those words, "if they stop treatment," lodged in his chest. Evelyn continued, quieter now. "I'll figure it out, just don't tell him. He worries enough." She ended the call. He waited until he heard her steps moving toward the kitchen before slipping back into the study, heart unexpectedly heavy. Medical bills. A younger brother, another life running parallel to the one she lived here. For the rest of the day, her voice on that call echoed in his mind. It threaded through the background of his meetings, pulled him out of focus when Sophie toddled into the room with Evelyn close behind. He wanted to ask, but there was a line between employer and employee, and crossing it meant something would change. It was late evening when the opportunity came, though opportunity wasn't the right word. Evelyn had just put Sophie to bed and lingered in the nursery, adjusting the mobile over the crib. Damian stepped inside, his presence filling the doorway. "Yes. I overheard you earlier," he began. No preamble. It felt strange, even for him. Her shoulders tensed. You shouldn't. No, he interrupted, his tone softer than he intended. But I did. Medical bills? For your brother? Evelyn didn't answer right away. She kept her gaze on the spinning shapes above Sophie's crib, watching them turn in slow, deliberate arcs. Finally, she exhaled. Yes, he's 12. He has a chronic condition. The hospital bills don't stop. You're supporting him. Her jaw tightened. I'm his guardian. The words landed with a quiet weight. Damian stepped closer, his voice careful. Where are your parents? Evelyn's eyes flicked to his, then away. Gone. It's been me and him since I was 19. Before that, she hesitated, as if testing the safety of telling him. Before that, we were in foster care. Different houses, sometimes the same, sometimes not. It was never stable. He leaned against the edge of the crib, not looking at her directly. That's why you're here, not just the paycheck. She gave a small, wry smile. I know what it's like to be left alone in the dark. I didn't want Sophie to know that feeling. Her words caught him off guard. They weren't dramatic, just simple and true. For a moment, he saw her not as the help, but as someone standing in the same trench he was, fighting to protect a child from something they'd both survived. Long have you been doing this? He asked quietly. Since I was old enough to sign papers for him. I take jobs that let me be close to him, that give me enough to keep him safe. This one, it's more than I expected. Damian studied her face in the dim light, the way her eyes stayed steady even when her voice softened. There was no self-pity, just a kind of fierce practicality. He thought of how easily people in his world dismissed the staff, never imagining they carried stories heavier than their own. Take your hand out of your pocket. You could have told me, he said. What would you have done? She asked gently. Given me a raise out of pity? I don't want charity. I want work that matters, and I want to be good at it. He didn't have an answer, not one she'd believe. They stood in silence until Sophie stirred, rolling to one side. Evelyn instinctively leaned down, tucking the blanket around her small frame. Damian noticed how natural it was for her, how love and skill were so seamlessly woven together. You're good at it, he said finally. Evelyn straightened. So are you. You just hide it better. He almost smiled, but the moment felt too fragile to risk breaking. Later that night, long after the house had gone still, Damian walked past the nursery on his way upstairs. The door was ajar. Inside, the lamp glowed faintly, and Evelyn was on the floor again, her back propped against the wall, knees drawn up, head tilted to one side in sleep. A blanket had slipped halfway off her shoulders. For a moment, he just stood there, taking in the quiet picture. Sophie sleeping in her crib, Evelyn keeping watch even in exhaustion. He stepped in without a sound, lifted the blanket and draped it fully over her. She stirred slightly, but didn't wake. He let his hand rest there for a second longer than necessary, then turned and left, closing the door softly behind him. The following morning, sunlight poured through the east-facing windows, making the hardwood floors gleam. Damian sat at the kitchen table with a cup of black coffee, but his mind wasn't on the day's schedule. The image of Evelyn, asleep in the nursery, lingered, her hand almost touching Sophie's crib, that quiet posture of someone who'd given everything she had to protect someone smaller. Evelyn entered quietly, hair pulled back, a faint wariness still in her face. She set a mug of tea on the counter and moved to check the diaper bag, as if the conversation from last night had never happened. You didn't sleep in your room, Damian said without looking up from his coffee. Her hands paused over the bag's zipper. The floor in the nursery is closer. You have a guest room, he reminded her. She met his gaze then, her eyes clear. I've slept on floors before. This one's cleaner than most. He didn't know whether to admire her resilience or resent the way she carried it so casually, like it was just another fact of life. You don't have to prove anything here, he said. I'm not proving anything, she replied softly. I'm making sure she's okay. That was the end of it, for now, but throughout the day, small pieces of her story kept surfacing, uninvited, in his mind. The brother with medical bills. Foster care. the determination in her voice when she said she didn't want charity. By mid-afternoon, he found himself walking past the nursery again. Sophie was napping, Evelyn seated beside the crib with a book in her lap. She looked up when he entered. "How I feel about what you told me last night." Evelyn set the book aside, waiting. "I said you've been his guardian since you were 19. That must have been a lot." She gave a faint smile. "It's easier to be responsible for someone else than it is to fix yourself. At least for me. He needed stability, and I could give him that, even if I didn't have much else." "You still don't take help easily," he observed. Her smile dimmed, but she didn't deny it. Help always came with strings attached. In the foster system, nothing's free. Someone's always keeping. Damian leaned against the doorframe. "Not everyone's like that," she said, "but it's hard to unlearn the rules you grew up with." There was a long pause between them. Sophie stirred, and Evelyn instinctively reached over to lay a hand gently on the blanket, soothing her without waking her. Damian's eyes followed the movement, a strange tightness settling in his chest. At night, after Sophie was down and the house had gone still, Damian stayed in his study later than usual. He told himself it was to finish work, but when he stepped into the hall, his feet carried him back toward the nursery. The door was ajar again, the lamplight spilling across the floor. Evelyn was there, exactly as before, seated on the rug, knees drawn up, her head tilted back against the wall. But this time she wasn't asleep. She was staring at the crib, her expression unreadable in the soft light. "You're going to ruin your back if you keep sleeping there," he said quietly from the doorway. She didn't flinch. "I've had worse." He stepped inside, kneeling beside her so they were at eye level. "You don't have to keep doing this. Sophie's safe here. You're safe here." Evelyn's eyes flicked to his, searching for something. Truth, maybe, or proof. Safe is not something I'd take for granted. Damian didn't push. Instead, he reached for the folded blanket draped over the back of the rocking chair. He shook it out and laid it over her shoulders, his hands brushing lightly against her arms. She looked at him then, not with gratitude exactly, but with a quiet acknowledgement, a truce of sorts. He rose and stood there a moment longer, watching her settle into the blanket. Sophie shifted in her crib, letting out a tiny sigh before sinking back into sleep. Evelyn turned her attention to the child again, and Damian saw something shift in himself, a recognition he hadn't expected. This woman wasn't just part of his household staff. She was someone who understood what it meant to protect a child with everything you had, even if it meant carrying the weight alone. And for the first time since she'd arrived, he began to wonder what it might mean to let her carry some of that weight with him. Not because she was paid to, but because she wanted to. He left the nursery quietly, but as he closed the door behind him, the thought stayed. Tomorrow, he knew, there would still be distance between them, but tonight, at least, something had changed. Not enough to name, but enough to feel. It began with a meeting Damian hadn't particularly wanted to attend. His business associate, Victor Hale, was visiting the estate to finalize details about an upcoming charity gala that would feature several of Damian's corporate partners. The conversation in the study had been cordial at first. Numbers, Sophie's laughter, drifted faintly from the garden. Victor's eyes shifted toward the sound, his tone sharpening. "That's her nanny?" Damian glanced toward the French doors. "Yes, Evelyn." Both of her brothers reluctantly agreed. "She's a high-priced woman." Logan gripped his wife, shoes off, in the grass, hair down, chasing the girl like it's a playground. "Damian, this is a high-profile household. Presentation matters." Damian's jaw tightened. Sophie was laughing. "That matters more." Victor leaned back, unconvinced. "We both know the media will be present at the gala. If they catch sight of that kind of informality, it reflects on you. A household says something about the man who runs it." The words stuck in Damian's mind long after Victor left. They shouldn't have. Normally, he dismissed such commentary without thought. But as he walked through the hallway later, he could still hear the faint echo of Victor's tone, judgment disguised as advice. When he reached the garden, Evelyn was crouched beside Sophie, helping her examine a cluster of wildflowers that had sprouted near the hedges. Sophie held one up with a grin, and Evelyn returned it with genuine warmth. Damian waited until Sophie darted a few steps away, chasing a butterfly. "Victor Hale was here," he said evenly. Evelyn straightened, brushing grass from her skirt. "I saw his car leaving." "Payen, opinions." Her brows lifted. "About me?" He said, "He thinks your methods are unconventional for a household like this." Evelyn tilted her head, studying him. "And do you agree?" His pause was brief, but noticeable. "I think he has a point about presentation. This is not an ordinary environment. Appearances matter." Something flickered in her expression, not quite anger yet, but a tightening around her eyes. "You mean, I should stand in the background, keep quiet, and never let Sophie get grass stains on her dress?" "I'm saying," he stopped, the words tangling, "you're good with her. No one's denying that, but there are expectations in my world. Rules." Evelyn crossed her arms. "And Sophie's supposed to grow up under those rules, learning not to laugh too loudly or touch the earth with her hands?" 2 years ago. "That's not what I'm saying." "It's exactly what you're saying," she countered, her voice low but steady. "I'm here for her, Damian. Not for Victor Hale. Not for the cameras. For her. She's a child, not a prop in a business deal." The remark landed like a strike he hadn't braced for. "This isn't about treating her like a prop. It's about your image," she finished for him. "I get it. I've worked for families like that before, where the photos mattered more than the people in them." He took a step closer. "That's not me." "Then prove it," she said quietly. The air between them shifted, not hostile but charged, the way it feels when truth has been spoken and can't be taken back. From across the lawn, Sophie called out, holding up her hand where the butterfly had briefly landed. Evelyn's expression softened instantly, but her shoulders stayed squared. Damian noticed the way she looked at Sophie, like the child's joy was worth more than any polished image in the world. When Sophie ran back and threw her arms around Evelyn's legs, Damian saw it clearly. Her defiance wasn't arrogance, it was protection. Love, unfiltered and unapologetic. And for reasons he couldn't explain, that realization left him more unsettled than angry. Damian didn't expect the conversation to stick with him, but it followed him into the evening like an echo. He'd told himself it was irritation that Evelyn had crossed a line in challenging him. But it wasn't irritation that kept replaying her words in his head, it was the truth in them. Sophie was tucked in early that night. The rain had returned in a slow, steady rhythm, tapping against the nursery windows as Evelyn hummed to her. Damian stood in the hallway for longer than he meant to, listening to that low, soothing sound, before turning away and heading downstairs. He found Evelyn in the kitchen later, rinsing out Sophie's cup. She didn't look up when he entered, but her posture shifted ever so slightly, aware of his presence. "How about earlier?" he began. "I'm not sorry," she said before he could go further. Her voice was calm, not defensive, but there was steel in it. He leaned against the counter. "But I do want to understand why you push back so hard." She set the cup down, drying her hands slowly. "'Cause I've seen what happens when no one does. Kids fade into the background, while adults make decisions that look good on paper and hollow in real life. Sophie deserves more than that." He studied her. "You think I'd let her fade into the background? You said, you're surrounded by people who care more about what the world sees. That you're surrounded by people who care more about what the world sees than what's real. That changes a person, even if they don't notice it." Her words landed heavier than he wanted to admit. He thought of the dinners, the galas, the endless meetings where Sophie was mentioned like an afterthought in conversations about lineage and legacy. He hated the truth in what Evelyn was saying. "He doesn't know my world," he said quietly. She agreed, "But I know hers, and I know that when she's with me, she gets to be a child, not an accessory." He should have been angry. Instead, he found himself wondering when the last time was that someone had told him something so plainly. They stood there in silence, the sound of rain filling the space between them. Then, faintly, from upstairs came Sophie's voice, soft, uncertain. "Mama?" Both of them froze. It wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable. The word carried down the staircase like a small, fragile arrow, hitting something in Damian's chest before he could react. Evelyn's eyes widened. "She's half asleep," she said quickly, as if to soften the weight of it. "She probably didn't." But Damian had already turned toward the stairs. He found Sophie still tucked in, her little hand clutching the edge of her blanket. Her eyes fluttered open at the sound of his footsteps, but she didn't say the word, "again." Evelyn appeared in the doorway, hesitant now, her earlier defiance tempered by something else, uncertainty, maybe even fear. Damian looked at her over Sophie's bed. There were a dozen things he could have said in that moment, about boundaries, about roles, about how dangerous it was to blur them. But instead, he just stood there, caught between the world he'd always lived in and the one Evelyn seemed determined to give Sophie. When Sophie's breathing evened out again, he stepped back. Evelyn remained by the doorway, eyes on the child, her hand resting lightly against the frame. For the first time, Damian didn't see the nanny. He saw someone who had built a bridge between Sophie's small, guarded heart and the wider, messier world. And maybe, against every instinct he'd learned to survive by, he wasn't sure he wanted that bridge taken down. The house had gone still after Sophie's bedtime, that rare hour when the soft hum of the nursery monitor replaced the usual chatter of the day. Damian stood in the hallway outside his study, a glass of untouched whiskey in his hand, his gaze drawn toward the faint golden light spilling from the main sitting room. He hadn't meant to seek her out, but somehow his feet carried him there. Evelyn was curled into the far end of the couch, her knees drawn up slightly, a book resting loosely in her hands. She looked up when he stepped in, surprised, then offered a small smile that didn't quite hide her caution. "How was you unwinding a bit," she said, as if she needed to explain her presence in the formal part of the house. "You're welcome here," Damian replied, moving toward one of the armchairs. "Actually, I was hoping we could talk." Her fingers closed the book, marking her place with the ribbon. "Is something wrong with Sophie?" He said quickly. "She's fine. Better than fine, actually." He hesitated, then added, "I realized tonight that I haven't felt this kind of peace in my own home since before her mother passed." The admission seemed to catch her off guard. Her eyes softened, and for a moment she looked as though she might ask him to elaborate. Instead, she folded her hands in her lap, her voice quiet. "That means a lot coming from you." "I'm not always the easiest person to work for," he said, a dry edge to his tone. She allowed herself a small laugh. "You could say that," but the humor faded almost instantly. "Honestly, I've been terrified at times." He leaned forward slightly, elbows resting on his knees. "Terrified. You'd decide I wasn't what Sophie needed," she said, her eyes fixed on her clasped hands. "Not because of the paycheck, though that helps me keep my brother's medical bills covered. It's because she feels like family. I didn't expect that to happen, and now, the thought of leaving..." Her voice caught, and she stopped herself, drawing in a steadying breath. Damian watched her, the weight of her words settling into his chest. He'd heard countless people talk about Sophie as an asset, a responsibility, a future heir, but Evelyn spoke about her like she was simply a Sophie, a child, a heart, a home. "You've been more than I expected," he admitted, "and I don't just mean for Sophie, for me too." Her gaze lifted to meet his, and something unspoken seemed to pass between them, an understanding that didn't need to be wrapped in formalities or gratitude. There was a pause, long enough for the air between them to shift. Damian's hand moved without much thought, resting on the edge of the couch beside her. Evelyn hesitated, then set her own hand there too, their fingers brushing lightly. Neither of them pulled away. The quiet felt fragile, like something they both instinctively wanted to protect. His eyes lingered on hers, and hers on his, the faint hum of the monitor in the background the only reminder that they weren't entirely alone in this house. Then came the faintest sound, a small, muffled cry drifting through the monitor's speaker. Both of them turned toward it instantly, instinct riding hesitation. "It's Sophie," Evelyn said, already rising. They moved in sync without a word, taking the stairs together. The monitor's soft static was replaced by the sound of Sophie's whimper as they reached the nursery. She was sitting up in bed, cheeks flushed from sleep, one hand rubbing her eyes. Evelyn was at her side first, smoothing back her hair and murmuring something Damian couldn't quite hear. He moved closer, watching as Sophie leaned into Evelyn's touch like it was the most natural thing in the world. Damian adjusted the blanket while Evelyn fetched her cup of water. Sophie took a sip, then nestled back against her pillows, her gaze drifting between the two of them. For a moment, Damian thought she might speak again, that she might say that same word from earlier, but she only sighed and closed her eyes. When her breathing evened out, Evelyn stepped back, and Damian followed her into the hallway. They stood there in the dim light, neither rushing to return to the sitting room. Damian's voice was low when he spoke. "I've been thinking. I'm done letting anyone else decide what's best for Sophie in this house." Evelyn tilted her head slightly. "What do you mean?" "I mean," he said, meeting her eyes, "I want you here. Permanently. No more wondering if someone's going to pull the rug out from under you. No more worrying about whether you fit into someone else's idea of acceptable." Her breath caught. "Damian? Better than that. You've earned this," he said, and there was no hesitation in his tone now. "Not just with what you do for Sophie, but with who you are. And I'm not going to let criticism or appearances take that away." For a second, she didn't answer. Then her eyes glistened, and she nodded once, slowly. "Thank you," she said, her voice steady even as her expression betrayed just how much the words meant. Damian gave the smallest of nods in return, and for the first time that night, the weight in the air between them felt lighter. The offer hung between them, steady and unwavering, and Evelyn found herself searching his face for any sign of hesitation. There was none. His expression carried the same calm resolve she'd seen earlier when he had smoothed Sophie's blanket in the dark nursery. A quiet assurance that this wasn't a passing sentiment. "I don't know what to say," she admitted, her voice quieter than she intended. "It's not often people keep me." Something flickered in Damian's gaze, something like understanding. "Then, maybe it's time someone did." Her throat tightened, and she was grateful for the dim lighting that softened the sheen in her eyes. She gave a small nod, not trusting herself to speak without her voice breaking. They made their way back downstairs, but the atmosphere between them had shifted. The usual formality had given way to something warmer, something almost fragile. Damian gestured toward the couch. "Sit for a minute. Let's not rush back to our corners of the house just yet." She hesitated before settling back into the same spot she'd occupied earlier. Damian remained standing for a moment, looking at the fireplace, as if weighing whether to speak. Finally, he lowered himself into the armchair across from her. "You know," he began slowly, "I used to avoid this room. Too many memories tied to it." Evelyn tilted her head. "Of Sophie's mother?" He nodded once. "Claire loved this space. She would sit here in the evenings, even when she was too tired to do much else. I stopped coming in after she passed. It felt empty." His gaze met hers, steady. "But tonight, it doesn't." The warmth in her chest deepened, but she kept her tone light. "Well, I can't take all the credit." Sophie's laughter probably helped. "Too," he said, his lips curving faintly. "But it's more than that." Silence followed, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Evelyn found herself studying the way the firelight caught on his features, softening the edges of the man who so often kept his guard up. There was an openness there tonight, something she suspected he rarely let anyone see. "I was scared of you at first," she confessed before she could think better of it. "Not because you were unkind exactly, but because you seemed unreachable. Like nothing I did would ever be enough." Damian's brows drew together slightly. "And now?" she said, offering a small smile. "I think I've learned you notice more than you let on." He leaned back, studying her for a long moment, then said simply, "I do." Her pulse jumped at the quiet conviction in his voice. She shifted slightly, tucking her legs beneath her, trying to keep the moment from feeling too weighted. "Well, I still don't know what you saw in me that made you keep me around." "I saw someone who makes Sophie feel safe," he said without hesitation. and someone who doesn't treat this house like a paycheck. That matters more than you know." The words lingered in the space between them, and Evelyn wasn't sure how to respond. Before she could try, a faint rustle came from the monitor again. Sophie's voice, soft and uncertain, drifted through. Not a cry this time, but a sleepy call. Both of them rose at once, their steps naturally in sync as they crossed the room and headed upstairs. When they reached the nursery, Sophie was sitting up again, her blanket twisted around her legs. "Hey, little one," Evelyn murmured, kneeling by the bed. "Did you have another dream?" Sophie nodded, her eyes half closed. Damian moved to the other side, helping untangle the blanket. The way their hands worked together, without pause, felt almost like they'd been doing this for years. Once Sophie was settled, Evelyn smoothed her hair back, and Damian stayed just long enough to see her eyes flutter closed again. They stepped into the hallway, their voices low. "She trusts you," Damian said, his tone more statement than observation. Evelyn glanced at him. "I trust her too?" Back downstairs, neither of them suggested ending the night. Instead, Damian refilled their water glasses and returned to the sitting room. Evelyn found herself relaxing into the couch again, the tension she'd carried for months loosening by degrees. It struck her, suddenly, how strange it was that this conversation, this fragile bridge between them, might never have happened if Sophie hadn't stirred twice tonight. Fate, or something like it, seemed to have nudged them toward this exact moment. Damian rested his forearms on his knees, leaning forward slightly. "I meant what I said earlier. This isn't temporary anymore. You're part of this household now, permanently." She met his gaze, her voice steady despite the thrum in her chest. "Then I'll do everything I can to make sure you never regret it." "You're welcome," he said, and there was not a shred of doubt in his tone. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, the fire casting its quiet glow over the room. Evelyn thought about how far they'd come from the clipped exchanges of her first week here, from the walls they'd both built for their own reasons. And in that stillness, she realized something else, that the promise he'd made tonight wasn't just about a job. It was about trust, about belonging. That night, long after they both went to their separate rooms, the air in the house felt different, warmer, safer, and somewhere between the crackle of the fire and the soft hum of the nursery monitor, Damian had made his decision. And one he had no intention of ever taking back. The late morning sun bathed the park in a warm golden light, catching in the curls of Sophie's hair as she toddled ahead, her laughter ringing clear over the quiet hum of weekend life. She was braver now, taking more steps on her own, but every few moments she would glance over her shoulder to make sure they were still there. Damian with his hands in his pockets, walking at an easy pace, and Evelyn a few steps closer, ready to scoop her up if she stumbled. "Careful, sweetheart," Evelyn called, though her tone carried more pride than caution. Sophie squealed in response, wobbling toward a patch of daisies. Her small hands reached for the blooms, and she turned, grinning, to show her prize. Damian bent down, not just to admire the flower, but to meet his daughter's eyes. "Beautiful," he said, brushing his fingers over her hair. "Just like you." Evelyn felt the words settle in her chest, warm and steady. There had been a time when she wasn't sure if Damian knew how to speak to Sophie without the restraint that had once guarded everything he did. But the last 6 months had changed them, all of them. They found a spot beneath a wide oak tree, its leaves whispering gently overhead, and spread out a blanket. Sophie plopped down between them, immediately setting her daisy in Evelyn's lap like a gift. Evelyn smiled, tucking it gently into the braid over her shoulder. "Do you want juice or water?" she asked Sophie, opening the small cooler they'd packed. "Juice," Sophie said decisively, holding out her hands. Evelyn poured a small cup while Damian set out the rest. It was such a simple scene, yet to Evelyn it felt like the culmination of something she hadn't dared hope for. 6 months ago, her world had been a precarious balance of paychecks, rent deadlines, and the constant fear of being uprooted again. Now, there was laughter, safety, and a little girl who ran into her arms without hesitation. Damian leaned back on one hand, watching Sophie take a bite of her sandwich with exaggerated care. "She's gotten so much more confident," he said quietly to Evelyn. "She's had a lot of encouragement," Evelyn replied, meeting his gaze. The look he gave her held layers. From across the park, a sudden flicker of movement caught Evelyn's attention. A man with a camera lowered his lens just enough for her to see the logo on his press badge. Her stomach tightened instinctively. Damian noticed too. "Fine," he said calmly, reaching for Sophie's juice cup before it tipped over. "We can't control if they take a photo, but I'd rather it show us like this." She hesitated, then followed his gaze to Sophie, who had started humming a tune Evelyn had taught her. It was true. This was their life now, and there was nothing to hide. Later that afternoon, when they stopped at a small cafe for ice cream, the inevitable happened. A folded newspaper on the counter caught Evelyn's eye, and there they were, she, Damian, and Sophie, captured in the sunlight, the headline curling across the page, "From employer and nanny to family." Her breath caught. She wasn't sure if she should laugh, blush, or ask for the paper to be recycled immediately. Damian, however, picked it up, glanced at the photo, and smiled faintly. "You're not wrong," he murmured, folding the paper neatly before slipping it into the crook of his arm. When they returned to the park, Sophie was drowsy from ice cream and excitement, leaning into Evelyn's side as they walked. Damian glanced over, his expression thoughtful. "Please, something I've been meaning to tell you," he said, as they reached the shade of the oak again. Evelyn looked up, curious. "What's that?" "I've started a foundation," he said, watching her closely, "for foster children. It'll fund educational programs, therapy, and safe placements, and I named it after you." Her steps slowed. "After me?" "You've given Sophie something I can never fully repay," Damian said, "and I know your childhood wasn't easy. This felt right." The lump in her throat was instant and impossible to swallow. "Damian, You don't need to say anything," he interrupted gently. "Just know, it's already in motion, and it's because of you." Evelyn blinked against the sudden rush of emotion, unable to find words that matched the weight of what he'd done. They reached the blanket again and settled down, Sophie stretching out between them. Damian leaned back, one hand resting protectively near his daughter's side, the other braced behind him. Evelyn lay down too, propped on her elbow for a moment before easing onto her back. The canopy above them swayed softly, letting dappled sunlight spill across their faces. Sophie reached out in her half-sleep, her small hand finding Evelyn's, then curling into Damian's as well. No more floors for Evelyn, no more walls for Damian, just the three of them, with sunlight and laughter and the quiet certainty that they had, against all odds, become a family. The breeze shifted, carrying the scent of cut grass and distant lilacs, and Evelyn closed her eyes. She didn't need to see the sky to know it was clear. She could feel it in Sophie's breathing, in Damian's steady presence beside her, and in the knowledge that whatever storms might come, they would face them together. And for the first time in years, she didn't just feel like she belonged, she knew she did. They stayed like that for a long time, three shapes on a blanket under a listening tree, the sun warming their faces in moving patches. Sophie's fingers flexed against theirs, then relaxed again, a drowsy rhythm that matched the leaves overhead. The city existed beyond the fence and the path and the soft murmur of families drifting past, but inside the circle of their blanket, it felt far away, like a sound traveling through water. "Tell me about the foundation," Evelyn said at last, her voice a hush so as not to wake Sophie. "Fully." Damian turned his head toward her. "It starts small, but not timid. Legal setup is done. The first grants will go to a tutoring program and a placement initiative that keeps siblings together. Too many are split because it's easier on paper." His eyes lifted toward the canopy again. "Keeping them together would have changed everything for me." "No," he said. "That's why your name belongs on the letterhead, not as decoration, as direction." A flock of tiny birds threaded through the branches and landed near a bench, bursting up again when a child ran laughing below them. Soph stirred and rolled closer to Evelyn, her cheek pressed to Evelyn's shoulder. Evelyn turned slightly to shelter her, and Damian adjusted the blanket without a word, the three movements forming a single gesture. "Help," Evelyn said. "Not just as a name, I can talk to caseworkers, mentor older kids, whatever is needed." "That's what I hoped you'd say," he replied. I've already spoken to the director of a local group home. They want you on the advisory board. Part-time, flexible hours. She smiled at the thought. I can do flexible? Sophie opened her eyes, blinked against the light, and lifted the daisy Evelyn had tucked into her braid. She studied the flower like it contained a secret, then offered it toward Damian with solemn ceremony. He accepted it between thumb and forefinger, grinning like he'd been handed a medal. For me? He asked. For it, Sophie said, pleased with the phrase. She laid the stem across both their hands so they had to hold it together. Then she giggled and tucked her head back against Evelyn's arm. They ate in small intervals as the day drew outward. Halves of sandwiches, a few bites of apple, the cookies dipped in milk from a thermos. Between each small meal came the true nourishment. Toying without rush, letting silence be companionable, trading looks that said more than the sentences did. When Sophie toddled away to look at a line of ladybugs, Evelyn and Damian followed at a loose distance, an invisible thread keeping them the perfect space apart. Not hovering, not absent, present enough to be there. By mid-afternoon, a playful wind rolled across the grass. Paper kites appeared over the hill like bright fish in the sky. A boy lost his grip and his kite dipped dangerously toward a pond. Before Damian could say a word, Evelyn had already jogged a few steps, waved to the boy, and caught the trailing string with a quick, sure snatch. The boy's father thanked her, flustered and grateful. Evelyn waved it off and returned to the blanket. Damian watched her settle, the wind tugging a curl loose at her temple. You always move first, he said. I used to wait, she replied. Waiting didn't help many people. He looked at Sophie, then back at her. No, I suppose it didn't. They sprawled again beneath the tree. The park's sounds thickened as the day ripened. Dogs shaking their collars, a vendor's bell, the low glide of a train in the distance. A familiar couple passed by and offered polite greetings. Their eyes lingered, curious. Damian introduced Evelyn with her full name and added simply, "We're family." Later, his phone buzzed with a press alert about the Foundation's first partnership. He silenced it without reading. I should get used to that, she said. You shouldn't have to get used to anything that makes you smaller, he answered. If anyone wants to understand us, they're welcome. If they want to reduce us into their categories, they can walk on. She let the words settle. Thank you. He shook his head. No, thank you for teaching me how to say that and mean it. Late afternoon, light leaned long across the lawn. Sophie insisted on holding both their hands at once and marched them in a parade down the path, knees high, singing a song she invented, the words tumbling into brave little nonsense. On the second circuit, she announced. They lay side by side, shoulders nearly touching, Sophie between them tracing shapes in the air with her finger. Cloud bunny, she declared. Cloud boat. Cloud cookie. Which one can we eat? Damian asked. None, Evelyn answered. But we can remember the taste. Sophie nodded, solemn and satisfied with that answer. A breeze lifted the edges of the newspaper Damian had tucked near the basket, revealing the photo again. Evelyn studied it with a steadier heart. The image caught Sophie mid-laugh. Her arms reaching toward the camera, Evelyn turned slightly toward the child, Damian looking past the lens at both of them. The headline allowed less like intrusion now and more like a timestamp of a door that had finally stayed open. Do you think Claire would say? Evelyn asked gently. He didn't flinch at the name. That Sophie looks like joy. That I look like I finally remembered how. Evelyn's hand found the blanket near his, not touching, only close enough for warmth to cross the small space. Then we're doing it right. They fell quiet again, the easy kind of silence that happens only when nothing important is waiting to be said. A maple leaf skated down through the light and landed on Sophie's stomach. She squealed, captured it, and insisted it was a crown. They took turns wearing it, admired by a queen who laughed so hard she hiccuped. The sun slid lower, and families began to gather their things. Damian packed slowly, neither eager nor reluctant to leave. They had no reason to hurry. Home was not a place they had to brace against anymore. When everything was stowed, Sophie crawled onto the blanket and sprawled on her back with theatrical abandon. Rested, she announced, commanding them to follow. They obeyed, lying beside her in a simple row, heads aligned, shoulders nearly touching, the tree's leaves forming a cathedral of shifting green above them. "You're here?" Evelyn whispered. "Hear what?" Damian asked. "Sound we haven't reached yet, but already carry," she said. "It's the same sound this tree makes." He listened. At first he heard only the rustle, the soft traffic, the far-off bark. Then he recognized the true thing she meant, an ordinary peace, unremarkable and rare. Sophie's hand drifted, found Evelyn's fingers, then Damian's, and bound them without effort. They stayed that way, 3 points connected by a small hand and a thin daisy stem laid carefully across their palms earlier. The light dappled their faces, and everything unnecessary fell quiet. No more floors, no more walls. Only a family, held together by a child's steady breathing and the promise to keep choosing this again and again, in sunlight and in storm, in the public eye and in the privacy of their most ordinary days. When they finally rose, the imprint of their shoulders remained in the blanket, 3 shapes side by side, like a map of where they had learned to begin.